We interrupt this incredibly awesome music to bring you some incredibly awesome political talk on Damn Radio.
Hello, good morning, welcome. I'm Samuel Trapp. This is International Flavor. You are listening to Damn Radio. You can send me emails at live@damnradio.com. You can call in 573-746-8020. It's been a rather horrific weekend. But before we get to those headlines, I wanted to give you a path before we start naming names and pretend that today's show is about perhaps any one horrible country or one horrible war or one crazy political system. I want to set this frame somewhat properly because we're living through some times where, appearances do more work than reality does. Performances, have theater has certainly replaced governance. Confidence is a staged narrative. Whatever limits are treated as some kind of a moral failure rather than a fact of life. And systems built this way, they're just hollow, you know it? And that's the world we're going to discuss today. I don't want to talk about panic, although I feel sometimes panic is necessary. It's not about cheering for a collapse of one system over another, anything like that. It's not even about predictions. It's about credibility. Who has it? Who spent it? And what happens when credibility is run out before the guy even takes the stage, before you listen to a word anybody says, and certainly ran out long before the power did. These still same idiots have the power. Over the weekend, events, commentary around the world converged on something something pretty unusual. Everybody's agreeing with each other that it's not agreement, it's not ideology, but they diagnosed the problem. Quite a few people have talked about what the problem is. Very different voices speaking to different audiences, all circling the same sort of conclusion, that systems that run the modern world are just exhausted. And it's exhausting. It's exhaustion even. That is changing human behavior. Exhaustion isn't a revolution. That doesn't look like it's disengagement. It looks like pretty much disbelief. Nobody believes anything anymore. Looks like people adjusting their expectations downward. And, institutions continue speaking as if nothing has fundamentally changed. And the disconnect between reality and what we're told is the real story. When governments say there's no immediate threat and violence still occurs, people don't hear reassurance. They hear insulation from the consequences for these leaders. When leaders say the economy is strong while households are all feeling quite squeezed, they don't hear optimism. They hear distance. Jesus, how far away is this guy from reality? When officials say extraordinary measures are temporary and those measures are routine and become permanent, people don't hear necessity. They hear, well, that's par for the course. They've taken more power. And this is how trust erodes, not through one lie, but through repeated mismatch between language and life, and so I want to kind of follow up on that because, war and horrific events become some kind of a theater. Law has a narrative and what it's, what they get to say happens. Finance is now leverage. Media is just noise instead of real news. It's just noise. And most importantly, it's about what happens inside a society when people stop believing that the people in charge are telling them the truth. One big thing to come out this weekend, and I'm going to get to the horror stories that are part of this also, but one of the big things to come out is the similarity from voices. It's not just bravado. It's not just, hey, I'm right. Look what I found out. It's impatience with all the illusion that we're given. Why can't we find people who are going to conduct horrific events sometime before, especially when we know about it, hear about it all the time? Does a flag on a video mean control of a situation? Is a speech governance? No. Governance is quiet, steady, consistent. Narratives a narrative is not performance. And eventually, reality catches up with you, because it always does. And I don't know, we've been told for years, rules are absolute until they're inconvenient, till they don't matter anymore. Markets are neutral until they need to be weaponized. Emergency powers are rare until they become permanent. And each exception is justified. Each shortcut is rationalized. And slowly, the system teaches all of us that the same lesson: everything is conditional. Nothing is steady. And once people internalize that lesson, they change their behavior. Citizens disengage politically. Countries act differently, move their money. Compliance is selective. We follow this rule, but we're not going to follow that one. And trust, this is the worst part, becomes only personal instead of institutional. You don't trust any of the institutions. And none of this requires any sort of conspiracy. It's mechanical. It's what rational people do when there's no predictability. It's why, things like multipolarity is not about ideology or value. It's about the escape from being dependent upon somebody else. Now states are hedging their bets. People are hedging their bets and always have. Everyone is hedging because the system that once guaranteed stability is now kind of an improv. An improvisation is dangerous in this sort of field. The real risk today isn't to not collapse tomorrow. It's how brittle the systems are. Systems that looked stable, they have no slack. They have no room for play. Institutions that function only as long as nothing unexpected happens. Something unexpected happens and it's a bailout. We got to bail it out. Leadership culture confuses certainty with strength and restraint with weakness. And that's how decisions are very bad. They aren't making any good decisions, certainly not early. Takes them forever. Try one route, doesn't work. Try another one, I'm not here trying to sell you fear. I'm trying to sell you reality. I'm trying to tell you about reality because nobody believes a damn thing anymore. And once exhaustion turns into anger, options disappear. Once disengagement turns into rejection, legitimacy can't be rebuilt all that easily. Recreating a system not full of lies and mistruth is extremely difficult. We're watching that right now. And once systems rely on enforcement instead of the consent of the governed, they're dangerous, expensive, and still fragile. So I don't know. It's reality isn't. Let's walk through the world as it really is, not as they advertise it to be. It's. Let's go to a couple of these horrific stories that occurred over the weekend, starting in Australia, if you will. And I think it's it's quite depressing. Here it is, and we have. Let's talk about how Netanyahu talked about this. I don't know if you saw that yet. So basically on Bondi Beach, I think it's called, is, last time I looked at it, which admittedly was like 1 o'clock in the morning, was that there were 12 people dead. And it's probably, it's 15 according to this news article, this new one that just came out. And we have Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is blaming the Australian government for this deadly attack on a Jewish gathering in Sydney over the weekend. He said that the support for Palestinian statehood fuels domestic anti-Semitism. Now, that's nonsense. That's not right. People are just idiots. These two gunmen, father and son, killed 15 people and wounded dozens of others at a Hanukkah celebration at Bondi Beach on Sunday. Police shot one of the attackers, who was an elder member of the father and son pair. A local Muslim man was praised for intervening and tackling one of the assailants and disarmed him. That's a video that's unbelievable. I thought he was going to shoot the guy. Part of me felt like he should. Netanyahu claimed the violence was the outcome of the policies pursued by Prime Minister Albanese, which he blamed for promoting and encouraging anti-Semitism in Australia. Now, if that's not a world leader taking a horrific event and using it to his benefit politically, I don't know what is. And, I don't even necessarily completely disagree. Anti-Semitism's out there, but, anti-Palestine is sure as hell out there. I mean, geez, how do you equate 1,200 or whatever it was killed on October 7, wasn't it 2023? And since that time, 70,000 Palestinians have been liquidated by the Israelis. I'm not saying right, wrong, and different. I'm saying it's clearly, and they're killing women and children over there, and people justify it by going, oh, geez, that's tomorrow's terrorists, so it's okay. We justify blowing up a ship carrying alleged narco traffickers with zero evidence because they're disease in America, period. We'll believe when we want to believe, but we have zero standards for what you say to the public, to the people. You can disagree with people, and freedom of speech is a right that I think should be universal, and it's not in some places. So Australia did formally recognize Palestine at the UN General Assembly in September and joined several other countries that wanted to pressure Israel over the military campaign in Gaza. And Netanyahu has repeatedly vowed to prevent the establishment of the Palestinian state. He said, your call for a Palestinian state pours fuel on the anti-Semitic fire. It rewards Hamas terrorists. It emboldens those who menace Australian Jews and encourages Jew hatred now stalking your streets, said Netanyahu. Now think about that. It's okay for him to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. And you know what? I'm not a big enough expert. I know that issue has been going on my entire lifetime. And, you can, what happened to self-determination? What happened to people? Who created this? Hell if I know. I don't blame only the Palestinians. I don't blame only Hamas. The mass shooting stemmed from Australian government's weakness and inaction in combating the cancer of anti-Semitism, he said. And Albanese focused on domestic gun policy in his response to the attack, which is what we do here in America. We talk about domestic gun policy. Democrats will get on and blame the handgun and not the person. He called for restricting ownership, good Australia, same idea. Police said the deceased suspect legally owned 6 firearms that were, some of which were used in the assault, right? The Bondi Beach attack was Australia's deadliest mass shooting since the 1996 Port Arthur massacre, in which one lone gunman killed 35 people. Israel, for its part, launched its operation in Gaza after the October 2023 attack. The campaign expanded to strikes in Lebanon, Yemen, and included a brief but intense exchange of drones and missiles with Iran. Authorities in Gaza say the death toll exceeds 70,000 and continues to rise, despite a U.S.-backed ceasefire announced in October. That ceasefire hasn't gone anywhere. You say there's a ceasefire, but is there? I don't think so. This is where it is. And we had a couple other shootings around the world happened as well. And, it just continues to grow. I'm not a gun... I'm not a person who believes that guns cannot be owned. I believe in the right to bear arms. I believe in that. I believe in that not for killing people. I believe it not for engaging in political acts of destruction of certain categories of people that you don't like, but to protect you and your family from the overreach of the government. That's what I believe in. It's not... You have the right to defend yourself, but most of it, you need to defend yourself against the government. I think that's why it's important that people... Is there really any deterrent on the side of the public anymore to stop their government from doing what they're going to do? No, not really. But owning a weapon kind of makes us feel like maybe there is. And the trouble is because nobody will ever band together. You heard about Rob Reiner and his wife getting killed in their homes yesterday, or what might even have been late Saturday. And they've been saying it's the son of Nick Reiner, I think was his name. There is his name, that allegedly killed them, stabbed them both to death. And it's, another horrific story. Rob Reiner was meathead on All in the Family with Archie Bunker. And he called him Meathead. And he's been a somewhat of a meathead, politically ever since, all this, but according to the beliefs, if you go against what he's extremely liberal, but I don't know. Let's, there used to be a hard line between, and this is especially important when these narratives and reality checks, if you want to call them that, stuff like that, is especially true when you get into war and the theater surrounding the war. Because here you want to talk about some sort of reality check or comic relief tour. It's nonsense. A line that everyone understood, even when they didn't articulate it, was that war is what actually happens. Used to be, anyway. Movements of men, control of certain territory, supply of cities, administration of populations. A slow, grinding pressure that decides outcomes long before speeches are written. Theater comes afterward. Theater is how wars are explained, justified, commemorated, or mythologized once the reality was settled. Now that is gone, and the line hasn't blurred, it hasn't faded, it's completely collapsed. We live in an era where war is fought, filmed, edited, staged, counterstaged, narrated, and packaged in real time for your emotional, growth and edification, right? Not after the fact, but during the fact. Flags are dropped by drones into contested zones for a few seconds of footage. Leaders appear on the front line without actually being there, without exercising any command. Cities can be walked through on camera without being found, fed, governed, or secured. Entire populations can now be persuaded that what they are watching is reality, even when reality has moved far, far away in the opposite direction. This weekend, across a rather wide spectrum of commentary, think about this: Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and America, one theme keeps appearing. Whether the speakers admit it openly or not, reality is no longer trusted. Only verification is. And political systems, somewhat like our own, that rely on symbolism, optics, and emotional, performing monkeys, are beginning to fail because symbolism no longer survives contact with the outcome. The outcomes are so far from reality, or, I'm sorry, not from reality. The outcome is the reality, but the outcome is so far from what we were sold as reality that it's just nonsense. And I watched the Sunday night program, as I try to, Vladimir Solovyov every week. And it was not emotional, it was not triumph. It was, kind of corrective and managed and somewhat depressed. He wasn't speaking like someone was trying to sell victory to an audience. He was speaking like someone trying to prevent the audience from believing all the crap that's being sold out there, including illusions that might even come from his own side. He returned again and again to a single brutal idea. You can show anything now, and that doesn't mean it's true. I mean, it's constant in our world. And I'm sitting there going, well, happen to agree. And he explained that modern technology has destroyed the evidentiary value of your own eyes, of what you're seeing. Drones can appear anywhere for just a few seconds. Footage can be edited, recycled, slowed down, sped up, stabilized, reframed, stripped of any context. Artificial intelligence can enhance clarity, sharpen detail, create emotional coherence where none exists. In this environment, the image itself proves absolutely nothing. At one point when he was discussing all this, he said something real close to this. You can place a flag anywhere today, but a flag does not control a street. A flag doesn't control a neighborhood, and a flag does not feed a city or police a population. Only control can do that. And he kept asking the same questions over and over in different ways. Who holds the street the next morning? Who controls the checkpoint overnight? Who stays after the camera is gone? Who pays the salaries of those who are still there? Who delivered the electricity and the water? Who enforces the law when there is no audience? Those questions, he says, are the only questions that matter, especially in war, and anything else is just a decoration. And what makes this important is that Solovyov didn't limit his criticism to Ukraine or the West. He explicitly warned Russian commentators, bloggers, not to fall into the same trap. I mean, this is important for our station here. It's hard to get truth. It's hard to even receive truth, especially when an AI goddess is telling you what you want to hear instead of giving you the truth and reality. It's your perception that matters to the AI in 90% of the cases. So he cautioned these bloggers and analysts not to confuse, footage on YouTube with power or mistake symbolic gestures for operational success. not to let emotional satisfaction replace a sober assessment. He said in a language that cut certainly across his own business, across modern media, that war isn't cinema. War is administration, it's logistics, it's endurance. War is boring until it's a decisive victory one way or the other. I mean, that idea alone explains why so many audiences misunderstand conflict. Boredom isn't what trends, but boredom is what wins the war. You know, this boring progression along the front, that wins the war, not these shallow propaganda efforts. And I'm talking about Zelensky showing up on the front line. And you should see the difference in the video versus the reality of the spot where he showed up. It's crazy. It's a narrative discipline. It's an attempt to re-anchor expectations in reality. And what makes this so striking is how closely it aligns with criticisms that are coming from inside Ukraine itself, and criticisms that I make and several others make on this program all the time. Guy named, and I talk about him all the time, and I like to compare these two guys. I like to compare what Solovyov is saying, because he's far one side, far Russia, pro-Russia, and then Aleksey Arestovich, although he's somewhat anti-Zelensky because of reality, he is saying the same things. So this criticism is coming from him, same sort of criticism is coming from Ukraine itself. And Aleksey Arestovich also yesterday. His commentary was precisely, devastating, because it came from, this Ukrainian political and psychological space. He wasn't speaking as an enemy. He wasn't attacking Ukraine as a country or a people. He is Ukrainian. He was attacking a style of leadership that we all need to think about, because it substitutes performances for real governance. And he's discussing Zelensky's repeated, quote, battlefield appearances, the short visits, the carefully framed footage, the selfie moments, Zelensky governing by selfie. Arestovich asked a question that Western media never asks because it breaks their narrative. What is the job of the president during war? Seriously. And Arestovich asked this on his show yesterday. What's the show? He said, it's not what looks brave. It's not what inspires applause. It's not even what produces a shareable image. What is the actual function of the audience, he asked. And his answer was not very glamorous. He said the job of the president in wartime is to govern, preserve institutions, maintain constitutional order, and ensure continuity of the state. To protect the population's future, not a dancing bear performing on the camera, in a green shirt, pretending to be, courageous like he does. Wearing that green shirt all over the friggin' place, switching it to black every once in a while. But that's all he does. He's tries not to be too much of a comedian anymore. He's not funny, that's why. He used to be, but he sure isn't now. This is not funny. He made a statement, Arestovich did, that should have been front page news everywhere, but was pretty much ignored. He said, pretty much word for word, that he would rather have the most cowardly president in the world sitting behind a desk if the country remained lawful, intact, and alive. That's what he said. That sentence challenges, the myth of modern leadership. It says competence matters more than imagery, heroism, alleged, or an administration matters more than symbolism. And he didn't stop there. He said Zelensky's behavior does not project confidence, it projects pressure. Pressure from Washington. He's got to go out there and create these false narratives that he's standing on the front, so that he can claim, oh, no, we're winning. Oh, no, we're pushing them back. Oh, no, they're lying. They don't have Pokrovsk. I do. Here I am on the front with a flag. They're certainly not in, what was the name of that city? Smolensk? No, I can't remember the name of the city. But it's now openly pushing timelines and compromise. Washington is. Pressure from intelligence services that are monitoring the political environment inside Ukraine, where he has no backing. Pressure from corruption scandals that have moved beyond containment. He's on the chopping block now. He's gotta make it look good so that people want to keep him, as some kind of guy they can still pump a buttload of money to. Pressure from a battlefield situation that is deteriorating faster than he can adjust the narrative. So, he was beaten on Zelensky himself, and Arestovich. And at one point, he gave us, a phrase that applies far beyond Ukraine. When authority is shrinking, performance expands. That's not a personal insult. It's political law. Whenever real authority is weakened, the leaders compensate it with some kind of symbolism. Geez, we're losing. We got it. Put me out on the front. Give me a video. It can be AI, no problem. Take this old Kvartal 95 and put me out there. Take this old video that I took when I was there in, 95 and give me some symbolism so I can make it look good. They replace control with imagery, competence with emotion, and governance with a performing Zelensky. You can get rid of the term dancing bear or performing monkey, and you can just call it a performing Zelensky, because that's all he's doing anymore. There's no truth in what he says. He even draws on the old Soviet military doctrine to make the point, Arestovich. When a commander leaves his post to carry the flag into battle, that may show bravery, but it also shows he is no longer doing his job. And in war, doing your job matters more than courage. This, presence matters less than command. Visibility matters less than control. Why does Zelensky have to go to the front line to prove he controls it? Now Putin's done that too. He's gone out to the front line, in certain places. But visibility doesn't really matter if it's gone, this visible spot is gone the next day, like it is, unfortunately, for them. Well, unfortunately, fortunately, it doesn't matter to me one way or the other. But reality is reality. This isn't about the personalities in the game. It's about the systems in the game. Modern leadership has been reduced to content creation. Clickbait, how much you get. And content never substitutes for authority. I bitch all the time about leadership through tweet, leadership through X post, or through social post. I don't like that either. Leadership isn't about who's telling the best story. It's not about personality. It's about citizenship. Systemship, having systems. The military summaries released this weekend reinforced this in cold technical language. An analysis of Seversk, Mirnograd, and the broader Donbass front, which is where Seversk is where Zelensky showed up on claiming to own the place, and he didn't. It's a fake video. The emphasis is not on dramatic breakthrough or cinematic victories. It's on structural exhaustion. Defensive systems failed, not because of a single catastrophic defeat, but because of sustained pressure, attrition, and logistical strain. One analyst states plainly that maps do not change because of one battle. They change because of fatigue. Exhaustion does not look dramatic on video. It does not inspire slogans. It doesn't trend on social media, but it does decide the war. This is why the United States has been pushing Ukraine to compromise now rather than later. Another commentator put it pretty bluntly. In 6 months, the map's going to be far worse for Ukraine. That sentence explains the urgency better than 100 diplomatic press conferences condemning Russia and, waving blue and yellow flags. It explains why symbolism is no longer enough. Now, let's go back a little wider with this lens, because this problem goes far beyond Ukraine. Technology has broken political signaling everywhere. In previous wars, presence implied risk. Footage implied proximity. I remember when, what the heck was his name? He was on Fox News, and I think he's pretty much retired anymore. But, damn it, what was his name? But he was always on the ground in Iraq 1. It's on the tip of my tongue, and I can't remember it. At any rate, it'll come to me when I'm not thinking of it. Control implies responsibility for the front, holding of the front. Today, artificial intelligence simulates presence. Drones create the illusion of control. Edited video conveys confidence, and there isn't any. Solovyov acknowledges this pretty openly when he says that modern technology, you can walk through almost any building you want on video. Real estate salespeople are doing that all the time now. You can create a video walkthrough that shows you walking through a home. It's not even hard to do. It's I don't know, this space heater is not heating. It's blowing cold air, freezing my butt off in here. But who controls territory over time? Who governs without collapsing? All those questions we were asking before. Who pays the salary? Who enforces the law predictably in those places? These questions matter more than visuals. Leadership that does not understand this will fail. Not because they're immoral, but because long-term they are ineffective. Quite. That's what it is. And the shift isn't confined to battlefields. They say there's no immediate threat until there is one, like allegedly these guys that did the shooting at Bondi Beach in Australia had been on the radar for some time. We've talked about attacks that have occurred here in the U.S. where people are on the radar for quite a long time, and they're not stopped. They're not, you still can't keep track of them, and they still conduct these atrocious events. So this weekend didn't mark the collapse of a front line. It marked the collapse of, continued collapse of credibility. And when credibility is collapsing, laws become flexible, assets or weapons, agreements become provisional, and escalation becomes unintentional. And that reality is now asserting itself. Benjamin Netanyahu gets to set the reality by blaming the Australian foreign minister because people attacked Jewish celebration, first night of Hanukkah. It's, I believe it's a mistake for him to do that, but, who the hell am I? But it's blame shifting. Take the attention away from, the atrocities of your own, here, blame this other guy. He's using it as a means to hopefully get some people back on his side, because he's been under the gun for a little while. So, I don't know. Once symbolism stops working, systems that relied on that symbolism begin to panic. One of the most striking things about the weekend is how often the same word keeps appearing in all of these commentators' shows that I like to watch. Exhaustion. Everybody's talking about exhaustion. Not defeat, not victory, exhaustion. Political exhaustion, military exhaustion, institutional exhaustion. And exhaustion behaves very differently from fear or ambition. Exhaustion shortens time horizons. Exhaustion pushes leaders to make decisions they wouldn't make if they believed that time was on their side. That is why so many commentators from so many different camps are suddenly talking about urgency. Urgency doesn't come from ideology. It doesn't, it comes from numbers, arithmetic. It comes from logistic. It comes from maps that change not because of dramatic breakthroughs, but because defensive systems slowly have lost coherence. The defensive system is collapsing. So in the military summaries that were released this weekend, particularly those that focused on Seversk and Mirnograd, the one east of Pokrovsk that I'll tell you about fairly frequently, and on the southern front, the language is not very emotional. There's very little talk of heroism or dramatic maneuvers. Instead, there's emphasis on what one guy called operational space opening up. That phrase, sounds like a technical military term, but it isn't. Operational space opens up when defensive lines no longer function. Not when a city falls in a dramatic moment, but when supply routes are stretched too far, when rotation schedules are non-existent, when units are replaced faster than they can integrate, when command decisions are made with incomplete information because time no longer allows them to deliberate. One commentator in military, summary put it this way: the map doesn't change because one position is lost. It changes because the structure behind the position can no longer support it. Now that's, what do you call it? That's an of course moment, of course, that, that's a statement. If you don't have support, you lose the position. But that's exactly what's happening right now in Ukraine. This observation does matter because it explains why so much political messaging now is disconnected from the reality on the battlefield. Political narrative. I mean, all these people dying in Mirnograd, they're encircled, are because Syrskyi and company, Zelensky and company wouldn't allow them to retreat and instead said, you got to stay there because, we have to keep the money flowing, basically. U.S. pressure on Ukraine has shifted quite sharply in tone these days. It's not that Washington discovered moderation. It's not that they even know what realism is, and they sure as hell don't know what goodwill is. It's that the military planners are reading the same indicators everybody else is. They're looking at manpower ratios, logistics, industrial replenishment rate, and political sustainability, and huge corruption on the Ukrainian side. And they are finally concluding the delay or waiting isn't going to improve Ukraine's negotiating position. It's only going to worsen it. And, another analyst said this quite bluntly. In 6 months, the map's going to be, astronomically worse. I mean, huge. Maybe we should get Donald Trump to say the word huge. Because I think he has. He said, that sentence carries more weight than 1,000 moral appeals to reason. It explains why compromise has to be discussed now rather than later if they wish to save anything east of the Donetsk. Hell, they're probably going to lose Odessa if this keeps on going. It's this is not rhetoric. When leaders train themselves to communicate through optics, here's a picture of me on the front. They struggle to transition to administration of government under pressure. They may know how to inspire. Arguably, the old Z Monster knew how to inspire when this first started. Sure was good at collecting money. He'd walk around like the dancing clown that he is, and walk away with another $100 million, and he still picks up pretty good $100 million every now and again, but people aren't as willing to pass it out. This dancing bear, nobody wants to see it anymore. So this is where Arestovich's commentary is ever so relevant. In one of his talks, he talked not only about Zelensky, but about the broader psychological trap that leadership falls into during a prolonged crisis. He called it, I thought it was rather interesting, he called it the hero loop. When leaders are rewarded for dramatic gestures, they repeat those gestures even when conditions change. And then they're trapped by their own mythology. In essence, that is not leadership. That's alleged courage, but without the governance that is required. It is self-destruction to applause. And applause, he notes, well, of course, it was an interesting statement he made. Applause doesn't fix infrastructure, replenish ammunition, or rebuild institutions. I mean, think about that. He basically, what he's claiming is that Zelensky is a performing animal. He performs, he gets rewarded. So he performs again. It's a Pavlov's dog sort of thing. you reward him, you can control his behavior, and he's been rewarded so long he doesn't know anything else. That's all he knows. And so, well, what can I show now? I can show me on the front, then maybe they'll give me more money and things will turn around. Maybe they'll steal that Russian money that's being held, And Arestovich returns repeatedly to the idea that the presidency isn't a stage role. It's not a stage role. It's an administrative role. And administration becomes more important as conditions deteriorate, not less. And he says Zelensky is doing too much performance and not enough governance. Interesting show it was that I watched. And the worse the situation becomes in Ukraine, the more boring the leadership must become, he says. And he said that's very hard truth in an age that rewards the drama. Solovyov, from a different ideological position, of course, he made a very similar point. He said that emotional intoxication is one of the most dangerous forces in war. Emotional intoxication. He cautioned against mistaking, morale theater for morale itself. He says morale that depends on illusions collapses faster than morale grounded in discipline and management of expectations. Wow. It's this convergence that really matters, isn't it? When commentators from opposing sides begin emphasizing the same structural reality, it suggests that the system itself is imposing constraints that ideology can't overcome. So, this pattern, again, it's not confined to Ukraine or Russia. It's playing out across the international system. Look at Europe's crazy responses to these same pressures. Faced with a war that isn't producing the promised outcome, European institutions have begun to improvise. They're making it up as they go along. And again, their improvisation is under exhaustion, and it's legal shortcuts. The discussion around the frozen Russian assets is a perfect example of all this. For years, European leaders insisted that property rights, legal predictability, financial neutrality are foundational principles of a valid government. Our founding principles. These principles were not presented as convenient. They were presented as moral absolutes. And now, under pressure, where do we come up with more money because the U.S. ain't just going to fork it over? They're being redefined. The language they're using is pretty revealing. Assets, Russian, are not being confiscated. They're being immobilized. Not seized, but repurposed. Not stolen, but used as collateral. These are not accidental, phraseology efforts, right? This is not an accident. These are attempts to preserve the appearance of legality while altering substance, making shortcuts. But markets really don't care about these euphemisms. Investors do not price rhetoric. They price precedent, and the precedent being set is unmistakable. Property rights now depend upon not the law, but upon your political alignment. We can steal anybody's money. Why? Because we have the power. We can blow up any boat we want to. Why? Because we have the power. That's what we can do. That is why even countries that strongly support Ukraine are uneasy about this. They know that once a principle is breached under emergency logic, it isn't going to heal. Not easily. Emergency measures have a habit of becoming permanent, like the state surveillance of Americans after 9/11. Temporary exceptions have a way of redefining the rules. Oh, give up your rights, for the common good. Those rights disappear, don't they? Solovyov highlights this repeatedly, not as a moral argument, but as a strategic one. He frames the asset seizures not only as theft, but as an escalation of the war. He says that when financial rules are weaponized, finance itself is the battlefield, and battlefields don't remain confined. Meaning, there's plenty of Western assets located still in Russia, and along with its, places where its allies are. Telling me they can't steal money too? Arestovich, similar angle, similar observation from a slightly different angle. He notes that when states abandon their own legal foundations, which seems to be going around, they weaken themselves more than they weaken their enemies. And we see that in Europe right now. He warns that legitimacy lost internally is harder to regain than territory lost externally. So let's go back to this broader theme of verification versus theater. Legal systems rely on predictability. Predictability, the same treatment for everyone, relies upon trust. Trust relies upon consistency between your stated principles and your actual behavior. That's important. Trust is consistency between your stated principles and your actual behavior. That's how trust is built. Trust is built by doing what you say you're going to do. Once that consistency is broken, no amount of narrative repair can restore it quickly. It takes a long time once the trust is gone. I mean, ask yourself this question. Do you trust your government at all? I mean, seriously, is there anything that you trust in your government other than they're going to act in the best interests of the people in charge? That money is going to be funneled to the same old people it's always been funneled to. That, unless you're connected, you will not succeed. If you are connected, you can overcome, issues. Does anybody believe that people aren't treated differently based upon who they know, not what they know? It's absolutely true. And so as long as you can figure out how to create a world where you make yourself connected to the right people, your success will be limited. And certainly trust is eroded in this country. Trust is gone, and I'm saying it's more of a certainly if you go on in a global scenario of who trusts our country on an international level, it's eroded. It's gone. And it's not gone because of Donald Trump, by the way. It was gone way before that. The way that the global elitists have acted has been obvious for at least my whole generation, if not before that. And I know that people watch it. Legal systems rely on predictability, right? And predictability relies on trust, that it'll be the same today as it will be tomorrow. And consistency between your principles and your behavior. Without that consistency, you have no credibility. This is why the credibility collapse that we are witnessing. Zelensky, the dancing bear on the front line that doesn't really exist. It's not localized. It's spreading. It's moving from the battlefield to finance, from finance to law, from law to diplomacy, and from diplomacy to domestic politics. Let's talk about the United States for a second. Our credit was downgraded. They're dismissed as technical adjustments. Our interest payments double in 5 years. If that doesn't scare you, it should. Banks are downgraded alongside. Banks in the U.S. are downgraded alongside with the United States. But the political messaging insists that nothing fundamental has changed. That's theater colliding with arithmetic. Check out Australia. Authorities insist there's no immediate threat. Statement can be technically accurate, but when the violence occurs, the public hears not reassurance, but incompetence. The language of control, no matter what, it doesn't match the outcome. Everywhere there's the same pattern. Institutions speak in the language of stability while behaving in the language of emergency. And that mismatch erodes trust faster than any propaganda campaign ever could. That is why public fatigue is becoming the dominant political emotion. Fatigue. Not anger. Not enthusiasm. Fatigue. People don't want narratives. They want outcome. They want results. They want predictability. They want leaders who can manage honestly, even if it's a decline, rather than disguising it as theater. And this is the most dangerous moment for any political system, because when theater stops working, like ours has, leaders have to choose between adaptation and escalation, between being boring but competent and being, dramatic and overreach. History suggests that most choose overreach of government. That's what they do. So this brings us back to where we started. Verification has replaced belief. How do you verify something? Outcomes have replaced images. Control replaces performance. And systems that don't adapt to this reality fail, not because they are evil, but because they're obsolete. So the question now isn't who is right or who is morally justified. The question is, who can govern under pressure without lying to themselves? Who can manage exhaustion without collapsing their own legitimacy? Who can transition from performing bear to an administrative expert before the options disappear? That question, defines what comes next, not only in Ukraine, but across the entire international system. It's true. It just is. And there's a moment in every long crisis, and trust me, this Ukrainian, trust me, you know how long it's been going on. It's been going on since 2014, but the escalation since February 2022. And there's a moment in every long crisis when the leaders stop pretending that the rules are going to save them and begin to rewrite the rules instead. That moment usually arrives not during victory and not even during a clear defeat, but during exhaustion, when the outcomes no longer match what was promised, when time stops feeling, like an ally to you, and when maintaining appearance is far more important than maintaining your principles. That moment is where Europe is now. For years, European leaders spoke in absolute terms about law, property rights, financial neutrality, rules-based orders. Not just because they're convenient, because they are civilizational foundations. Europe, we were told, was different because it subordinated power to legal, interests to principles, and politics to procedure. That claim is failing. This debate over the Russian assets that they decided this weekend. I've been following it for some time. And like I told you earlier, these Russian assets are being immobilized, right? Not seized. They're being repurposed, not confiscated. Not stolen, but transformed into collateral for a loan to Ukraine. These aren't neutrality words. They're, rhetorical shock absorbers designed to soften the reality that would otherwise be, and it is anyway, politically explosive. Because the reality is pretty simple. Sovereign assets held under custodial arrangements are being treated as political leverage. And once that threshold is crossed, law is no longer a constraint, it is the tool. Now, I don't know why this should surprise any of us, because those in power only follow the law when it's convenient. They force it upon you, but they don't follow it themselves, and so it has been a tool for a long time, but they're a little more sly about how they put it together, But this is why everybody knows who Viktor Orban is, and his objections matter far beyond Hungary. He's not arguing from any sympathy toward Russia. He's arguing from fear of setting precedent. What he says, in essence, is that if emergency powers can override vetoes, if legality is suspended by consensus of a few powerful actors, then the European Union is no longer a union of law. It's a hierarchy disguised as a legal order. And it's absolutely true. And what he's complaining about is over the weekend, Ursula von der Leyen and company chose to change the rules under emergency powers, it always required a unanimous consent of every EU member in order to change anything. Nope. They're now, they've changed it over the weekend. It's unbelievable. Well, I suppose it shouldn't be. It's not unbelievable. These guys, this is what they do. And Ursula von der Leyen's not even elected by anybody. I mean, it's nonsense. Excuse me. But what makes it most striking to me, anyway, is that resistance to this asset seizure plan is not coming only from so-called problem states like Italy, Belgium, Malta, Bulgaria, countries that aren't friendly to Moscow. They, have raised these objections. That's Italy, Belgium, Malta, and Bulgaria. They're not pro-Russia, not at all. They're the ones raising objections, not not moral objections. No. Structural, legal objections. They understand that once property rights are conditioned on political alignment, no asset is ever safe again. And I'm telling you, this is the type of thing that is making the rest of the world create alternative systems. 300 billion lost to Russia is not going to end Russia, right? If it hasn't gotten them so far, it's not going to. You know what I mean? And the country's still going to be there. They have the lowest debt among any major, country. Their debt ratio is incredibly small, especially when you compare it to us. They don't have huge debt. Nowhere near what we have here. And but investors, markets understand what's going on. They get it instantly. And investors don't debate morality, they price risk. That's what they do. They look at precedent, not press conferences. And the precedent being set here is unmistakable. If assets can be frozen indefinitely, redefined legally later, and converted into a political instrument of some sort, then custody itself is what is unstable. This is why financial institutions in London, Frankfurt, and Brussels have been warning against these moves. They're not doing it out of affection for Russia. They're doing it out of self-preservation. Because the credibility of Europe as a financial hub rests on predictability. And predictability can't survive selective enforcement. I mean, watch selective enforcement in any system. What is it? I mean, you pick and choose who you go after. Your system is BS. I talk about it with the Missouri bar, the selective enforcement. The nonsensical system that they use that is under no rule, no court rule, no statutory grant of power, certainly no executive order, nothing. And that's what they use to target specific people, like they did to me, and destroy them. That's what it's one person that wants to come after you and destroy you. And he made no bones about it. He said, I'm going to see that you never practice law in the state of Missouri again. That's what he said to me, and I laughed, But it's the exact same thing. When the system itself is corrupt or allows corrupt a-holes like this to be in charge and doesn't do anything about it, that is the problem. And this, there's no predictability, selective enforcement destroys any predictability of a valid system because a valid system doesn't exist. And Solovyov, again, he was pretty blunt. He said that when law becomes theater, finance is a battlefield. I think that's true. He said that asset seizure isn't just theft, it's escalation. Financial rules, once weaponized, retaliation probably won't be limited to court. It will move into systems, currencies, and alliances. They'll create their own systems, and that's what they're doing. Everybody is. Nobody's trading in the dollar. Why? And they're walking away from the euro too. No, everybody's trying to trade in their own currencies anymore because of things like this. This is the paradox. Arestovich says that when states abandon their own legal frameworks, they weaken themselves more than their enemies. He said almost identical thing. And he said that legitimacy lost internally is harder to recover than territory lost externally. Wow. A state that can regain land, it can, but it'll struggle far harder to regain lost trust. And this is the paradox that Europe now faces. In attempting to project some sort of resolve, it is undermining the very legal foundation that once distinguished it as a better than, as a prime example of how you should operate. And this erosion doesn't occur in isolation. It ripples outward everywhere. Once emergency logic is normalized, every future crisis will be justification for further exceptions. Vetoes are obstacles. That's what they have been for here. That's why they took emergency powers, because now Orban can't veto it. Orban can't veto. Nobody else can veto, because all it takes is a emergency power, which is what's happened here. Parliamentary debate is inconvenient, so they don't have to worry about it. It doesn't legitimize anything because now you don't need it. It's an emergency. Decision-making concentrates in smaller and smaller circles, just like in Ukraine. We see this already in the Committee of Permanent Representatives, where decisions with massive geopolitical consequences are shaped far, far from public scrutiny. This is why, this is what's happening. It's governance by invisible procedures and changes in the law with zero accountability. And there's a deeper danger. When law is reduced to a narrative device, it loses its discipline. Instead of constraining power, it decorates the power. Instead of limiting escalation, it rationalizes it. And once that happens, escalation accelerates because there is no longer a shared boundary, a respected boundary. Look at how quickly the conversation moved from freezing assets to using them. They're not just frozen, we're taking them. From temporary measures to indefinite ones. First it was, we're going to take the profits, the interest payments. I think that was BS, but they started keeping the interest when using the interest to fund Ukraine. Over years, this is a huge issue. And so the law is just a narrative device. It's nonsense. From temporary measures, now it's indefinite. This is a temporary measure. We're going to freeze Russia's assets temporarily. Trump says he's going to make sure it was part of the ultimate agreement that they get the assets back. They're trying to stop that for us even now. Crazy. Crazy. So let's connect this to the broader exhaustion that we were discussing previously. Europe certainly is not making these decisions from a position of confidence. They're in a position of fatigue. And the fatigue is worse because the U.S. has vastly reduced Although they're still giving $400 million in 2026 and $400 million according to the Pentagon budget in 2027. It's exhaustion and fatigue is producing impatience. They're supposed to be winning, and they aren't. This impatience is producing a shortcut, and shortcuts produce precedent that will not be undone. So comparisons to earlier financial crises are, somewhat misleading. In past crises, emergency measures were taken to stabilize the system. Here, emergency measures are being taken to maintain the narrative and force some sort of, some sort of reaction from Russia. They'll be sued. I mean, that's an easy reaction. And, that's a crucial distinction. Stabilizing seeks to restore the equilibrium, but narrative seeks to maintain or postpone a reckoning. It's you aren't getting a reckoning here. Markets are good at detecting what the difference is, and I think the markets are going to kick the crap out of Europe for this. And we're already seeing those effects. Capital flight isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It takes the form of diversification, hedging, reallocation, buying gold. It doesn't announce itself everywhere, but it does move. And once it moves, it's not coming back quickly. The same logic applies to alliances. States that trusted Europe, and European neutrality now reconsider their exposure. Not because they oppose Europe politically, but because they see that legal commitments are no longer insulated from politics. And this is where the phrase, these globalist, elitist a-holes in their rules-based order, that they've always talked about. The rules only apply to others, and it's always been that way. But this shows an absolute collapse of the rules-based order, and if you mistook it before and said, "Oh no, we follow our own rules," the West follows their own rules. Maybe not we, but the Western elites certainly don't follow any sort of rules-based order. They create their own. Rules for thee, but not for me. And, the rest of the world is seeing it once again. Here we go. And I've been bitching about this for, nearly an hour and a half now. And my entire show is talking about this. And the Hillary Clintons of the world to get to wander around the planet and tell people that, the rules-based order. This would be the same lady going, keep that money. Figure out how to keep that $300 billion of Russia's money and give it to Ukraine. That'll teach them. It'll teach Russia not to do what we tell them to do, because Russia has to follow rules, not us. We flex, if we need to. We, those rules for us, are flexible. So when European leaders insist that asset seizures are legal because they say so, that means they ignore the own warnings from their own financial institution, and trust me, markets are taking note of it. When Australian authorities insist that there is no immediate threat until a huge violent event occurs, the public takes note of that. Everywhere, the same pattern is emerging. Institutions speak in the language of stability, but they act in the language of emergency. This is why public fatigue has replaced ideology. People no longer want grand narrative. They want a system that is predictable and works. They want rules that apply consistently, to everyone, not just to you and the elites get away with what they want. They want leaders who tell the truth. They're not just a dancing bear. Don't sell me a performance. I don't want a performance. This is why the current moments are so dangerous. Because theater has stopped working. Theater doesn't work anymore. Leaders face a choice. They can adapt. They can become boring, competent, honest administrators, or they can escalate, doubling down on their own drama in the hope that momentum will substitute for their own legitimacy. I don't know. History suggests that many of them choose escalation. Europe's legal improv show around frozen assets isn't about Ukraine. It's about whether the law remains constraint on power or is a justification to take more power. That question will shape financial systems, alliances, and conflict long after this war is over. Because once the precedent is set that assets are contingent, law is conditional. An emergency overrides any sort of routine. There is no clean reset. System doesn't snap back to reality. It adapts to a new reality. A reality where power decides first and legality is followed afterward. I've said this for a long time, that judges, for the most part, decide who's going to win. If they're writing a judgment, they decide who they want to win. And then they find the law to support that position. They don't follow the law. They pick who wins and then find the law to get it. Because you can find any law that you want to, that'll support your position. You can always do that. The black and white, pretty slim pickings, black and white. It exists, Black is black and white is white, for example, but aren't there various shades of it? That's what any lawyer would tell you. There are shades to it. I don't know. When law becomes theater and finance is a weapon and the international system itself begins to reorganize, right? That is the world that follows the collapse of legal credibility, and that's what we want to have a look at next. One of the most important things to understand right now is that multipolarity doesn't arrive through declarations. It arrives through risk avoidance, through hedging, what I was talking about before, through states quietly deciding that dependency is more dangerous than inefficiency. And that process accelerates every time legal predictability is sacrificed for political expedience. The moment Europe began seriously discussing the permanent seizure or repurposing of Russian sovereign assets, the signal sent to the rest of the world was unmistakable. It wasn't support Ukraine. That was only how it was marketed. The signal was this: custody is conditional. Assets are safe only so long as political alignment with us is acceptable, is something that we accept. For countries watching from the global south, from Asia, from the Middle East, this is not an abstract legal debate. It's a practical lesson. If your reserves sit in a Western system, they're not reserves. They're leverage held by somebody else. So this is a world-damaging event, this $300 billion. $300 billion, that's not much, in the big, huge picture of Russia and what Russia's got. But this is why alternative settlement systems didn't suddenly emerge in 2022. They did accelerate. The groundwork had been laid long before. What changed was how urgently they needed to do it. To change. Russia didn't invent de-dollarization. China didn't invent currency diversification. India didn't invent bilateral settlement agreements without the dollar. What changed was the speed at which these ideas moved from contingency plans to active policies in those countries. One commentator said, in effect, the West taught the world a lesson it never intended to teach. money stored under someone else's rule isn't really your money. And once that lesson sinks in, behavior changed permanently. This is why BRICS expansion matters less for who joins than for what it represents. It's not an alliance in the NATO sense. It's a platform of options, a place where states can transact without total exposure to Western legal framework that only applies when you want it to, or until you decide it doesn't apply anymore. Critics mock these efforts as inefficient, fragmented, technologically inferior, but that misses the point. Redundancy is inefficient by design. It exists not to maximize profit, but to minimize vulnerability. Solovyov argues that sanctions no longer function as a primary economic punishment. They function as an educational tool. I found this very interesting. It's an educational tool. They teach states which system is safe and which is not. And once taught, these lessons are not unlearned. This is why the weaponization of finance produces the opposite intended effect over time. It doesn't isolate targets permanently. Arguably, Russia isn't isolated at all. It incentivizes the alternatives. And alternatives, once built, don't just disappear because the original pressure disappears. Arestovich said the same thing from a different angle. He said that Ukraine's tragedy isn't simply about invasion, but structural dependency upon others without sovereignty. A state that cannot maneuver economically or militarily without external approval does not possess full agency. It survives only by permission. Now, that's a scary thought coming from a Ukraine critic. What's going on? That observation also goes beyond Ukraine. It applies to any state whose financial system, trade route, legal guarantee is interrupted by external decision makers. Multipolarity in this sense isn't about equality, it's about escape. This is why Konstantin von Hofmeister's essay on Darwinian multipolarity resonates so strongly. He strips away the comforting language and says that many diplomats, what many diplomats won't say. Multipolarity isn't fair. It isn't polite. It is not cooperative by default. It's competitive. Ruthless. Only states with real sovereignty can afford neutrality. Everybody else has to choose alignment, dependency upon others, another country. Sovereignty today is not ideological. It's infrastructural. I talk about infrastructure all the time. It's the ability to settle trade without permission, to move capital without fear of it being seized, to enforce law without an external veto. So Orban wants to enforce his own law, to defend your own territory without begging for authorization. This is where nuclear weapons re-enter the conversation, not as a moral issue, but as structural. Nuclear states occupy a different category because they cannot be coerced without a risk, huge risk. That reality shapes negotiations, whether anybody admits it or not. Now let's get back to the United States, because American policymakers are not blind to these shifts. The national security strategy we discussed last week reflects this implicitly. It acknowledges rivalry openly. It abandons the fantasy of universal values. It respects resistance more than submission, and that distinction is critical. It was noted recently that Washington respects those who push back while demanding obedience from those who comply. That isn't hypocrisy, that's power logic. Resistance signals capacity, compliance signals dependency. This is why Western Europe is in such an uncomfortable position right now. For decades, it outsourced strategic autonomy to Washington while lecturing others about sovereignty. Now, as American priorities have shifted, Europe is discovering that dependency offers no leverage when the patron is no longer interested. And improvisation under exhaustion is dangerous. Danger, danger. Well, I appreciate you for listening today. I didn't quite get through what I wanted to get through, but I'll try to wrap that up tomorrow for you. I appreciate you being here on International Flavor, where the truth just tastes better. You can hear us, all the recorded shows at internationalflavor.com, or you can go to damradio.com/podcasts. You can listen to all of our wonderful shows here at damradio.com/live, and I hope you do. I'm here every morning, 7:30 to 9 a.m. I hope you join me all this week. Could be entertaining. Have a nice day.